In 1940, when RAF bombers began appearing over German cities, Luftwaffe commanders and civil defense planners immediately recognized that this represented a strategic threat requiring comprehensive defensive preparations. They recommended immediate expansion of fighter production, construction of extensive flak defenses, development of night fighter capabilities, and dispersal of critical industries. They calculated that Allied bombing would escalate and that Germany had perhaps 2 years to prepare adequate defenses before bombing reached levels that could cripple production. Hitler dismissed these warnings. He insisted that Germany's air power would be used for offensive operations, not wasted on defensive measures. Allied bombing was propaganda, not strategy, a nuisance that would end once Britain was defeated. That decision, to treat early Allied bombing as irrelevant rather than as warning of what was coming, meant that Germany entered the period of devastating strategic bombing in 1943 almost completely unprepared, having squandered 3 years when defensive measures could have been implemented at manageable cost. When RAF Bomber Command began operations against German targets in 1940 and 1941, the raids were small and caused limited damage. Bombers navigated poorly at night. Accuracy was terrible, most bombs fell on open countryside. The tonnages dropped were measured in dozens or hundreds of tons, not thousands. German authorities noted the raids but classified them as militarily insignificant. Propaganda portrayed them as terror attacks on civilians that proved British desperation. The early raids did not shut down factories or disrupt production measurably. They seemed to validate the assessment that strategic bombing was ineffective. What German leadership failed to recognize was that these early raids were not the campaign, they were training and preparation. RAF Bomber Command was learning navigation, developing tactics, and building the organizational capacity for much larger operations. The small early raids were reconnaissance for what was coming. Germany saw pinpricks and assumed that was all strategic bombing could achieve. Nazi ideology created fundamental bias against defensive thinking. The regime's entire identity was built on offensive action, conquest, and attack. Defensive measures were psychologically associated with weakness and defeatism. Hitler personally despised defensive warfare and consistently prioritized offensive capabilities over defensive preparations. This was not just military doctrine, it was ideological principle. Germany would attack its enemies, not cower behind defenses. The Luftwaffe's role was to support ground offensives and bomb enemy cities, not to defend German skies. Air defense was conceptually incompatible with the regime's self-image. When planners recommended expanding fighter defenses and flak production, they were arguing against deeply held beliefs about how Germany should wage war. The ideological environment made it nearly impossible to argue that Germany needed to prepare for sustained defensive operations. Such arguments implied that Germany might not win quickly through offense, which was ideologically unacceptable. Defense was what weak nations did. Germany was strong, therefore Germany attacked. Luftwaffe technical staff and industrial planners understood exactly what Allied strategic bombing could become. They had studied German bombing of Britain and recognized that what limited German efforts was capacity, not concept. They calculated that if Britain and America committed substantial resources to bombing, German cities and industries would face attacks that existing defenses could not handle. Assessment reports documented that Germany had insufficient night fighters, inadequate flak coverage, and no systematic civil defense organization. They projected that Allied bomber production would eventually create formations of hundreds or thousands of aircraft attacking simultaneously. Current German defenses could not contest such operations. The reports recommended immediate action, expand fighter production specifically for defense, build comprehensive flak networks around industrial centers, disperse critical factories, develop radar and night fighting capabilities, create civil defense infrastructure. These recommendations were specific, costed, and technically sound. They were presented to leadership as urgent priorities. They were filed and largely ignored. Germany's fighter production in 1940–42 was allocated almost entirely to offensive operations supporting ground forces or escorting bombers. Defensive fighter production was minimal. When planners recommended shifting production priorities toward defensive fighters, they encountered resistance from multiple directions. Ground force commanders wanted fighter support for their operations. Bomber advocates wanted escorts for offensive bombing. The available production capacity was already committed to these offensive priorities. Requesting substantial expansion of fighter production specifically for defense required arguing that Germany needed to prepare for sustained Allied bombing, which meant admitting that quick victory was not assured and that Germany would face a long defensive war. This argument was politically untenable. The result was that fighter production continued serving offensive priorities while defensive needs were postponed. Germany entered 1943 with defensive fighter strength that was adequate for small raids but completely insufficient for the campaign that was actually coming. The decision was not made once, it was made repeatedly through production allocation choices that consistently prioritized offense over defense. German military and political institutions developed systematic optimism about the war's trajectory that made defensive preparation seem unnecessary. Official assessments consistently projected that Britain would be defeated or negotiated with soon. America's entry extended the timeline but did not fundamentally change the assumption that Germany would win before Allied strategic capabilities fully developed. This institutional optimism was not based on intelligence showing Allied weakness. It was based on ideological certainty that Germany would prevail. In this environment, recommendations for extensive defensive preparations were implicitly pessimistic. They assumed prolonged war and Allied capability to threaten German homeland. Both assumptions contradicted official optimism. Officers and planners learned that highlighting potential threats to Germany was career-damaging while projecting confidence about quick victory was rewarded. The feedback loops reinforced optimism and suppressed realistic assessment. By 1942, the institutional culture made it effectively impossible to generate urgency about defensive preparations because doing so required admitting that the optimistic projections were wrong. German industrial planning through 1942 assumed that factories would remain safe from sustained bombing. Industries were not dispersed. Critical production remained concentrated in urban centers. Supply chains were optimized for efficiency, not resilience. No systematic plans existed for maintaining production under bombing. This was not oversight, it was deliberate planning assumption that Germany's air defenses and distance from British bases would prevent effective bombing. Industrial planners understood that dispersing production and building resilience into supply chains would reduce efficiency and increase costs. They calculated these trade-offs and concluded that defensive measures were not economically justified given the assumed low threat from bombing. The assumption seemed reasonable in 1941 when RAF raids caused minimal disruption. It was catastrophically wrong by 1943 when sustained bombing hit industries that had no redundancy, no dispersal, and no protective measures. The industrial planning that assumed safety from bombing meant that when heavy bombing came, German production had no resilience to absorb it. Anti-aircraft artillery production was constrained by the same prioritization of offense over defense. Germany produced substantial numbers of flak guns, but most were allocated to protect field forces or were sent to occupied territories. Comprehensive defense of German cities required thousands of heavy flak guns with extensive ammunition stocks, radar direction, and trained crews. This level of commitment was never made. Flak production was substantial enough to appear adequate but insufficient for the task it would eventually face. When requests came for massive expansion of flak defenses around industrial cities, the response was that existing production was sufficient for current needs. This was true as long as bombing remained light. It was completely inadequate for what was coming. The flak defense that might have complicated Allied bombing required beginning construction and crew training in 1941–42. Instead, those decisions were deferred until 1943 when bombing became heavy. By then, the resources needed for adequate flak defense were competing with desperate needs for tanks, aircraft, and ammunition at the fronts. The flak buildup that should have happened during the years of preparation never occurred. In 1942, Allied bombing noticeably escalated. Raid sizes increased. New tactics were tested. Damage grew more substantial. RAF Bomber Command conducted 1,000 bomber raids that demonstrated Allied capability to mass aircraft in unprecedented numbers. The Cologne raid in May 1942 involved over 1,000 bombers and caused significant destruction. German authorities acknowledged the raid but treated it as exceptional effort that Britain could not sustain. They assumed these massive raids consumed British resources too rapidly to be repeated frequently. They were wrong. The 1,000 bomber raids were proof of concept for sustained heavy bombing. Within months, similar raids were happening regularly. German defensive preparations remained minimal because leadership continued interpreting escalating bombing as temporary rather than as the beginning of sustained campaign. Each escalation was explained away as exception rather than recognized as indicator of what was becoming normal. By late 1942, the pattern was clear to anyone willing to see it. Allied bombing was growing exponentially and German defenses were inadequate. But institutional momentum and ideological bias prevented recognition that defense needed to become priority. Germany eventually developed effective night fighter capabilities, but the program started far too late. Night fighting required specialized aircraft, radar equipment, trained crews, and ground control systems. Developing this capability from scratch required years. Had Germany begun serious night fighter development in 1940–41 when professional assessments identified the need, effective defenses would have existed by 1943 when heavy bombing began. Instead, night fighter development remained low priority through 1942. When heavy night bombing started in 1943, Germany scrambled to create night fighter forces but faced years of development deficit. The aircraft, radar, and tactics that eventually made German night fighters effective came too late to prevent the 1943–44 bombing campaign from crippling production. The cost of beginning night fighter development 3 years late was that German cities and industries were defenseless during the period of heaviest bombing. By the time effective night defenses existed, irreplaceable damage had already occurred. In July 1943, Allied bombing of Hamburg created firestorm that killed over 40,000 civilians and destroyed much of the city. The raid demonstrated that Allied bombing had reached catastrophic scale. It should have triggered immediate comprehensive defensive mobilization. Instead, the response was inadequate and piecemeal. Some industries were dispersed. Some flak was redeployed. But no fundamental shift in priorities occurred. Offensive operations still received priority in resource allocation. The Hamburg disaster was treated as exceptional horror rather than as preview of what would happen to other German cities if defenses were not radically strengthened. Within months, similar devastation hit other cities. Each time, German leadership expressed shock but did not implement the systematic defensive mobilization that the scale of threat required. The Hamburg Firestorm revealed that Germany had entered a phase of war where cities could be destroyed in single nights, but institutional momentum and ideological resistance to defensive thinking prevented the response that this reality required. By 1943, Germany faced defensive fighter shortages that were exactly what technical staff had warned about in 1940–41. Luftwaffe fighters could not defend German skies against formations of hundreds of Allied bombers with fighter escorts. The numerical imbalance was overwhelming. Allied production had created bomber streams and escort fighters in quantities German defenses could not contest. German fighter production was finally increased, but it was competing with urgent needs for ground forces equipment, submarines, flak guns, and all other weapons. The crisis that forced increased fighter production in 1943 could have been avoided if production increases had begun in 1941 when first recommended. Instead, Germany entered the heaviest bombing period with fighter strength that was perhaps one-third of what defensive requirements demanded. Increasing production under bombing was far more difficult than increasing production during the years when factories operated without disruption. The fighter crisis was not caused by Allied superiority, it was caused by German decisions in 1940–42 that deferred defensive preparations until crisis made them urgent but difficult. The concentrated industrial structure that planning had created in 1940–42 became catastrophic vulnerability in 1943–44. When Allied bombing hit major industrial centers, entire production chains collapsed. Critical components became unavailable. Assembly plants shut down waiting for parts from bomb suppliers. The lack of dispersal and redundancy meant that damage cascaded through industrial system. Factories that were never bombed stopped producing because bombed suppliers could not deliver components. German industry finally began dispersing production in 1943–44, but dispersal under bombing was far more difficult and costly than dispersal during years of safety would have been. Moving machinery, rebuilding supply chains, and establishing new facilities while under attack consumed resources and time. The industrial collapse that bombing caused in 1943–44 was magnified by the concentrated structure that planning had created. Had industries been dispersed and supply chains built with redundancy in 1940–42 when professional planners recommended it, the same bombing tonnage would have caused far less production disruption. The vulnerability was not unavoidable, it was designed into the system by planning that assumed factories would remain safe. Strategic bombing created workforce crisis that was preventable through civil defense measures that Germany never implemented adequately. Workers killed in raids could not be replaced. Workers whose homes were destroyed spent weeks dealing with basic survival rather than working. Transportation infrastructure damage made reaching factories difficult. Adequate civil defense shelters, emergency services, evacuation planning, housing reserves could have reduced these impacts dramatically. Britain and later Germany developed such measures, but Germany's came late and were incomplete. The workforce disruption that bombing caused was multiplied by lack of civil defense preparation. Workers survived raids only to be unable to work because they had nowhere to live, no way to reach factories, and no support services. The industrial impact of bombing was not just destroyed factories, it was the disintegration of urban systems that kept workers alive and functioning. Civil defense measures recommended in 1940–41 could have created resilience that reduced bombing's impact on production. Instead, these measures were implemented piecemeal only after damage was catastrophic. By 1944, defending against bombing consumed enormous resources that offensive operations desperately needed. Fighter production for home defense competed with ground forces equipment. Flak guns defending cities were flak guns not supporting field forces. Radar and communications for air defense diverted resources from other uses. Personnel committed to civil defense and aircraft production were not available for frontline units. The resource commitment that defense finally received in 1943–44 was exactly what professional planners had recommended in 1940–41, but timing made it catastrophic. In 1940–41, building comprehensive defenses would have required resources but would not have competed with crisis needs elsewhere. By 1943–44, every resource committed to defense was desperately needed at collapsing fronts. Germany was forced to choose between defending homeland production or supporting field forces. Either choice led to failure. This dilemma was created by the 1940–42 decision to defer defensive preparations. Had defenses been built during years of relative resource abundance, they would not have competed with crisis needs in years of scarcity. Military historians analyzing Germany's response to strategic bombing consistently identify 1940–42 as the critical period when comprehensive defenses could have been built at manageable cost. The industrial capacity existed. The time was available. The professional recommendations were presented. Had Germany prioritized defensive preparations during those years, several outcomes were likely. Dispersed industry would have been more resilient to bombing, stronger fighter defenses would have inflicted higher losses on Allied bombers, potentially affecting campaign sustainability, better civil defense would have reduced workforce disruption, and defensive resources would not have competed with offensive needs during crisis years. The bombing campaign would still have occurred and caused damage, but the catastrophic industrial collapse of 1943–44 could have been significantly mitigated. This is not alternative history speculation, it is recognition that Germany had strategic choice in 1940–42 and chose offense over defense based on ideological bias and optimistic assumptions. That choice had predictable and predicted consequences. Germany's failure to prepare for Allied strategic bombing demonstrates what happens when ideological bias and institutional optimism override professional threat assessment. German technical and military staff correctly identified that Allied bombing would escalate and that comprehensive defenses needed to be built before heavy bombing began. They presented specific recommendations with clear timelines. Leadership rejected these recommendations not because the assessments were wrong but because defensive preparation contradicted ideological commitment to offense and implied that quick victory was not assured. The result was that Germany entered the period of heaviest bombing almost completely unprepared despite having years of warning. The industrial and urban damage that bombing caused was magnified by lack of preparation that could have occurred but was deliberately not pursued. This was not intelligence failure or resource constraint, it was leadership choosing ideology over professional military advice and optimism over prudent preparation. The cost was measured in destroyed cities, crippled production, and defensive resource diversion during years when those resources were desperately needed elsewhere. When Allied bombing campaign reached its peak in 1944, Germany faced exactly the situation that Luftwaffe planners and industrial experts had warned about in 1940. Bomber formations of hundreds of aircraft attacked with frequency and accuracy that overwhelmed defenses. Urban centers and industries suffered catastrophic damage. Production collapsed in critical sectors. Resources desperately needed for fighting defensive war at fronts were diverted to defending homeland. The comprehensive defensive system that Germany finally attempted to build in 1943–44 came years too late. The factories that should have been dispersed were destroyed before dispersal occurred. The fighter forces that should have been available were still training when heaviest bombing hit. The civil defense infrastructure that should have existed was incomplete when cities burned. Every consequence that professional staff predicted in 1940–41 materialized in 1943–44. The decision to treat early Allied bombing as irrelevant rather than as warning was not made once, it was made continuously through resource allocation choices that prioritized offense over defense year after year. Germany did not lack warning about strategic bombing. Germany ignored warning because defensive preparation contradicted ideological certainty about quick offensive victory. The cities and industries that burned in 1943–44 burned partly because leadership in 1940–42 chose ideology over preparation.